There is a town in northeast Ohio, about 30 miles east of Cleveland, that has spent 2 centuries trying to live down its reputation for darkness. Kirtland was the site of the first Mormon temple ever built on American soil, and it was also the town that Joseph Smith fled in disgrace in 1837 after a warrant was issued for his arrest. Local legend says he cursed it on the way out. Whether you believe in curses or not, what happened in Kirtland in the spring of 1989 is the kind of event that makes a place feel marked forever. A man who had convinced 20 people to give up their jobs, their savings, and their independent thought invited a family of 5 to dinner, killed every one of them in a pit he had dug in his barn while a chainsaw ran to cover the sound, and buried them under the dirt floor. The next morning, when federal agents came to his door, he sat down with them in his prophet's voice, answered every question, and watched them drive away without ever looking in the barn. Then, he packed up his followers and led them into the wilderness. The body stayed in the ground for 9 months. This is the Kirtland Cult Murders iceberg. April 17th, 1989, the day began with deliberate logistics. Jeffrey Lundgren and his followers spent the morning moving all of the Avery family's possessions into the farmhouse at 8671 Chardon Road. He told the Averys they were preparing for a spiritual wilderness journey, something he had been preaching about for months, which he said was required by Scripture before Zion could be established and Christ could return. He rented them a room at a nearby hotel, so they would have somewhere to stay that night before the group departed the following day. He had Cheryl Avery sit down and write a letter to her own mother. It said Dennis had gotten a job offer in Wyoming. They needed to move quickly. They were sorry they hadn't had more time to say goodbye. Cheryl wrote it. She mailed it. That evening, the Averys were invited to dinner at the farmhouse. They came. They sat down with the people they had followed from Missouri to Ohio, and they ate together. Then Jeffrey Lundgren went to the barn. Jeffrey Lundgren. At the surface, the picture of Lundgren that Kirtland had in 1989 was this: a large, charismatic man in his late 30s, a former lay minister with the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who had been dismissed from that position in 1987 under accusations of embezzlement. After his removal, he formed his own splinter group of about 20 followers on a rented farm outside Kirtland, gave tours of the historic temple as a recruiting pipeline, and positioned himself not as a lay minister, but as a genuine prophet of God. People called him Dad. His followers called him Prophet. To most of the community, he was an eccentric religious figure with an inflated sense of himself. To the people inside that farmhouse, he was the only path to Zion. That gap between those two perceptions is where the Kirtland case lives. The Avery family. Dennis Avery was 49 years old. His wife Cheryl was 41. Their daughters were Trina, 16, Rebecca, 13, and Karen, 6. They had been members of the World's Church their entire adult lives, first encountered Lundgren in 1986, and moved their entire family from Missouri to Kirtland in 1987 to live closer to the man they believed was a genuine prophet. They contributed their income to the group's communal finances. They attended every scripture session without question. And for years, Lundgren privately resented them for it. He thought Dennis was weak. He complained openly that Cheryl was too independent for a woman, that she made all the household decisions herself. He believed their children were unruly and disobedient. The Averys worshiped the man who looked down on everything about them. They never knew. The barn. Several days before the murders, a group of Lundgren's followers dug a large pit in the dirt floor of the farmhouse barn, approximately 6 feet by 7 feet, large enough to hold 5 people. Not everyone in the cult knew what it was for. The culture Lundgren had built made asking questions feel like an act of spiritual weakness. Members were explicitly forbidden to speak privately among themselves. Lundgren called it murmuring, treated it as a sin, and deliberately eavesdropped on conversations he then repeated back as divine revelation, manufacturing the impression that he could read minds. By the night of April 17th, the pit was ready. While the Avery family ate dinner inside the farmhouse, 4 of Lundgren's male followers filed into the barn and waited in the dark. "Are you with me?" Before going to the barn, Lundgren gathered the men of the group in a bedroom inside the farmhouse. He pulled a pistol from the holster on his hip and looked at each man in the room. He asked them if they were with him. Every one of them said yes. Present in that bedroom were his son Damon, Ronald Loof, Richard Brand, Daniel Kraft, and Gregory Winship. Not one walked out. Whatever combination of religious conviction, fear, financial dependence, and years of psychological conditioning Lundgren had built in those people, it held completely in that moment. Every man said yes. And they all walked to the barn together. The chainsaw. Ron Loof was designated to bring the Avery family members from the house to the barn one at a time on a pretext. Richard Brand and Danny Kraft were positioned inside to bind each person with duct tape before they were placed into the pit, and someone ran a chainsaw during the killings to muffle the sound of the gunshots. The detail that stays with you is this. While Dennis Avery was being bound and shot in the barn, Cheryl and the children were still inside the farmhouse, finishing dinner, cleaning up after the meal. The sound of a chainsaw running in a barn at night was not unusual enough to alarm them. They did not know. They were brought out one by one. Dennis first. Then Cheryl. Then Trina. Then Rebecca. Then Karen, who was 6 years old. Lundgren shot each of them himself, 2 or 3 times each. All 5 were bound with duct tape when they died. The pit was filled with dirt after the last body was placed inside. The entire thing took the length of an evening. Dennis first. Karen last. This detail appears in every account of the Kirtland murders and functions as the moral bottom line of the entire case. The father was taken first, so he could not protect anyone. The youngest child was taken last, which means she spent whatever time remained in the farmhouse unaware of what was happening outside, and was then led into a barn in the dark and killed by the man her parents had moved her from Missouri to follow. Lundgren referred to their deaths later as pruning the vineyard. He told the jury at his trial that he was not sorry. Karen Avery was 6 years old. Pruning the vineyard. Lundgren's justification for the murders was constructed entirely from his own interpretation of Scripture. He had been preaching for years that only the spiritually pure could enter Zion and witness the return of Christ. He taught that a third of the world was made to live with Christ, a third would have to fight for that right, and a third was made to be destroyed. He had found in the writings attributed to the prophet Enoch a framework requiring a blood sacrifice before the wilderness journey could begin. The avarice, whom he privately considered weak, disobedient, and spiritually insufficient, became the designated sacrifice. The term pruning the vineyard is a biblical metaphor for cutting away what does not belong. It tells you everything about how completely Lundgren had insulated himself from the moral reality of what he was doing. He was not a man who killed a family and knew it was wrong. He was a man who killed a family and believed it was obedience. The temple takeover. The Avery murders were not the first time Lundgren had organized violence in Kirtland. In 1988, he had announced to his followers that God had revealed through Scripture that they were required to take over the Kirtland Temple by force, to occupy the historic building as the first step toward establishing Zion. He set the date for May 3rd, 1988, his 38th birthday. His male followers had been undergoing paramilitary firearms training in preparation. A neighbor of the property reported the activity to Kirtland police officer Ron Andelsek. A former cult member separately warned authorities. Contact was made with Lundgren before the planned date. He called the takeover off, citing Scripture. The time was not right. He announced that the path to Zion required a different preparatory act first. What followed from that pivot over the next 12 months was the systematic planning and execution of the Avery murders. The failed temple assault was a dress rehearsal for organized group violence. When it was prevented, Lundgren redesigned the violence on a smaller, more intimate scale, the morning after. On the morning of April 18, 1989, less than 24 hours after 5 people were shot and buried in his barn, Jeffrey Lundgren answered a knock at the farmhouse door. Federal agents and local police had arrived to investigate the months-old tip about the temple takeover plan. They interviewed Lundgren and his followers. Cult member Susan Luff later testified about what happened during that interview, We were told what to say and what not to say. Every follower told the agents that Lundgren was a peaceable man, that there had never been any plan to attack the temple, that they were at the farm of their own free will. Lundgren himself answered calmly and without apparent stress. No one said a word about the barn. No one mentioned the Averys, whose absence no one outside the group had yet questioned. Cheryl's letter to her mother was still the only explanation for why the family had gone quiet. The agents found no grounds for a search warrant. They left. Lundgren watched them go. Then he told his followers it was time. The cult packed their belongings and drove out of Kirtland together, leaving 5 people in the ground beneath the barn floor. The wilderness. After the FBI departed that April morning, Lundgren and his followers loaded their vehicles and drove away. They spent the following months camping in state parks and forests, primarily through West Virginia and surrounding states, moving as a group under Lundgren's continued religious leadership. He held scripture sessions in the open air. He preached about the coming of Zion. He continued to act as a prophet, guiding his people through the wilderness, exactly as he had said the scripture required. The followers who had watched him kill a 6-year-old the night before stayed with him through that entire summer and into the autumn. The bodies of the Avery family lay in the barn they had left behind. No one had filed a missing persons report. Cheryl's letter was all the explanation the world had. Keith Johnson's betrayal. The thing that broke the case open was not a forensic breakthrough. It was jealousy. Keith Johnson was a senior cult member whose position in Lundgren's inner circle had grown over time. In late 1989, Lundgren announced through divine revelation that God had called him to take a second wife. The woman he selected was Keith Johnson's wife, Molly. Johnson refused. Lundgren excommunicated him from the group, and Johnson, now outside the group's silence for the first time, contacted the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and described in specific detail what had happened to the Avery family 8 months earlier: the pit, the order of killing, the names of those present, the location of the bodies. The tip reached Kirtland Police Chief Dennis Yarborough. On January 3, 1990, search warrants were obtained and investigators began excavating the barn floor at 8671 Chardon Road. Dennis Avery's body was found the first day, the rest of the family the day after. The case had been invisible for 9 months, not because Lundgren was forensically careful, but because 20 people had maintained a collective silence. It ended not because of investigative brilliance, but because a man did not want to share his wife. The arrest and the trials. Within hours of the bodies being removed on January 5, 1990, a Geauga County grand jury returned indictments. By January 7th, Lundgren was in custody in California. A widely reproduced app photograph from the San Diego Municipal Courtroom on January 4th. 1990 shows Jeffrey Lundgren standing flanked by Alice and Damon. He is large and composed. He does not appear afraid. He had, after all, spent years constructing an identity built entirely around certainty, and that identity did not crack when the handcuffs went on. 13 cult members were ultimately charged. Jeffrey Lundgren received the death penalty. Alice, who knew the pit was being dug and stayed, was sentenced to 150 years to life. Damon, who was 19 years old and present in the barn, received 120 years. Ronald Luff, who physically escorted each Avery family member to their death one by one while the others remained unknowing in the house, received 170 years to life. Danny Kraft received 50 years to life. Gregory Winship and Richard Brand each received 15 years and were paroled in 2010. Sharon Blunchley, Deborah Olivares, and Susan Loof each received sentences of 7 to 25 years. The range of those sentences reflects the range of participation, from the man who pulled the trigger on 5 people to the people who knew and said nothing while the wilderness trip went on. I am even more than a prophet. At his 1990 trial, Lundgren addressed the jury in an unsworn statement. He told them that speaking with God was not a delusion, but a factual description of his lived experience. He said, "It's not a figment of my imagination that I can in fact talk to God, that I can hear his voice. And then, I am a prophet of God. I am even more than a prophet. The jury deliberated for 2 hours and convicted him on all 10 counts. When asked throughout his legal proceedings about his feelings toward the Avery deaths, he returned consistently to the same formulation: he could not say that God was wrong, and he could not say he was sorry for doing what God had commanded him to do. This position held without visible internal conflict from his arrest in 1990 through his execution by lethal injection on October 24, 2006, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. His final statement before the injection was directed not toward the Avery family, but toward his own. He said, "I profess my love for God, my family, for my children, for Kathy." Kathy was the woman he had married on death row. The Avery family did not appear in his final statement. Damon and Danny speak. In 2025, 36 years after the murders, two of the people closest to Jeffrey Lundgren spoke publicly for the first time. Damon Lundgren, his son, present in the barn, sentenced to 120 years, and Danny Kraft, his most loyal follower, sentenced to 50 years to life. Both sat for filmed interviews as part of an investigative documentary series called Bloodline and Blind Faith, produced by Wocus in Cleveland. The series represents the most detailed first-hand account of the Kirtland cult's internal life that has ever been made available to the public. Kraft was asked directly about being in the barn on the night of April 17th. He shook his head and said, "It is a shameful act to do that to other human beings. There's no question. I don't care how justified I felt. That sentence is worth sitting with." He is not saying the justification wasn't real. He is saying it was real and complete in the moment, and that the moment was wrong anyway. That specific and difficult form of moral accounting took him 36 years to say out loud. The question the case leaves open. 20 adults were part of Jeffrey Lundgren's group on the night of April 17, 1989. Some were in the barn. Some were in the house while it was happening. Some had watched the pit being dug and understood what it meant. All of them drove out of Kirtland the next morning, spent months in the wilderness following the same man, attended his scripture readings, and called him prophet. The forensic psychology of cultic environments can explain the mechanics, manufactured authority, financial dependence, enforced social isolation, the systematic removal of independent judgment. But that framework only goes so far. At some point, every one of those 20 people made individual decisions. They said yes in a bedroom with a gun on the table. They walked to a barn. They stayed in the woods through a summer and an autumn. The Kirtland case is closed. Jeffrey Lundgren was executed in 2006. 13 people were convicted. Dennis, Cheryl, Trina, Rebecca, and Karen Avery have been in the ground in Ohio since April 1989. The question the case leaves open is not what Lundgren was capable of. It is what it takes to make 20 ordinary people stand still while it happens. That question does not have a comfortable answer, and it does not go away just because the case is closed. That is the end of the iceberg. Subscribe if you want to be here for more.